Hello there, listeners. This is an audio recording of my book, The Westwind Tales of Sword and Sand, which is book 1 in the Westwind Tales series. If you like what you hear, consider subscribing, leaving a like or a comment, or preferably all of the above. If you want more content like this, consider supporting the channel by purchasing my book on Amazon, becoming a channel member by clicking the join button, or, preferably, both. So sit back, relax, grab a cup of tea, and enjoy the chapter. Chapter 7. Du Bindedag of Edmund. The Binding of Edmund. Edmund's blood ran cold. His eyes darted towards Theod's body, laying on the floor behind the young weirder. Dead eyes stared blankly into the cell toward Edmund, blood oozing from his mouth. An innocent man. Tears began to well up in Edmund's eyes as he realized what he had done. The boy grinned and barked a hollow laugh at the sight. "That's right, Heslinweir. Weep, for the day of your reckoning has come. You shall pay for your crimes against the guild." Stepping back away from the door, the weirder spoke loudly into the cell. "Your trial begins now." He muttered a command, and the hexagon on his forehead began to glow white. The door to the cell swung outward, sweeping Theod's corpse to the side. He gestured for Edmund to exit the cell. Edmund remained on the floor, still reeling over what he had done. When he showed no signs of getting up, the weirder grunted impatiently and gestured again toward Edmund. The collar on Edmund's neck suddenly produced the same sharp pain as it had earlier. The pain grew quickly until he could barely keep himself from crying out. Somewhere, in his thoughts, a small bit of understanding appeared. It felt foreign and cold, like an idea was being forced into his mind. The collar. It was a metallic thought, wrapped in icy pain, inanimate and unwavering. Stand. Edmund knew that he must obey if he wanted the pain to cease. Shakily, he scrambled to his feet. The moment he was upright, the pain ceased. The unspoken command snaked back into the collar. The weirder laughed. "In the end, all people are the same. They can be as stubborn as any old mule, but with the addition of pain, their resolve turns to dust. Now, come with me or receive more of the same." He gestured once more to the open doorway, opening into the hall. Edmund grudgingly obeyed and plodded into the hallway. As the weirder led him from the building, he glanced once more at Theod's body, lying in a pile in the corner. Its accusing gaze followed as the door shut behind him. The weirder took Edmund through the streets of Rockford, toward the council hall. It was a large building constructed out of the old stone that appeared in the architecture near the center of Rockford. In the stonework along the building's foundation were chiseled small scenes. Most of these depicted courtrooms, hearings, or some long-forgotten judge declaring a sentence upon the guilty that stood before him. The council hall struck an impressive form, quite out of place against the backdrop of red brick and wood which made up the majority of Rockford's construction. Edmund paused and took in the hall's front entrance before a shock of pain ran through his collar, prompting him to continue. Inside the building was a single open room, filled with chairs arranged in a circle facing the center of the room. The light pouring in through the windows shone upon the faces of those who filled the seats. Edmund recognized a few of them. George, with his arm in a sling, glared across the room at Edmund. Brandon darted his eyes around the room in fear. The most difficult to look at, however, was Abigail. Red with tears, her eyes were deep pools of hatred. Her gaze was fixated not on the weirder, but on Edmund. His jaw tightened with realization. She thought he was the one who killed the man she loved. He quickly glanced around. Bloody Yammer, he thought. They all do. Panic began to seep into Edmund's bones as a hush settled over the crowded council hall. The weirder behind him gave a shove, and he stumbled into the middle of the room. A hole in the roof cast a ring of light around him. He felt naked beneath the eyes of so many people. The weirder paced a circle around him, running his piercing gaze over the silent crowd. Opening his mouth, he began in a dramatic, authoritative tone, an odd sound coming from one so young. "I am Merritt Longstride, Truthseer of the Weirding Guild. I have been summoned here to ensure the peace of the township of Rockford, of the Galehammer fiefdom, in accordance to His Majesty's decree. I bear with me the full authority of the Illuminated Guild, of the Ammer of Order, and, of course, His Majesty the King. I hereby call this court of witnesses to share their testimonies, that they might shed the light of reason, justice, and order upon these dark events. Who will step forth?" There was silence as his voice penetrated to the corners of the packed room. After a moment, there was a creaking of wood as George stood up from his chair. Wincing, he gingerly made his way to the center of the room where Edmund stood, stopping just outside of the ring of light. Merritt turned to him and spoke. "State your name, citizen of Rockford." George looked over at the weirder, then at Edmund as he spoke. "My name is George Baker." "And what do you have to say concerning this matter, George Baker?" asked Merritt. George cleared his throat and continued, casting quick glances around the room at the seated men and women. "I've known Jupin Hatcher for many years. Never once was he unfair or unkindly. He was a shrewd businessman, yes, but never anything more. He always helped those who needed it, and never did he ask anything in return." Turning his back to Edmund, George faced the crowded seats. "A few days ago, I tried to kill the man standing before you." Astonished gasps and mutters trickled through the crowd. George continued, growing more intense as he spoke. "I tried to kill him, but Jupin stopped me. He defended the man." He turned swiftly around and pointed at Edmund. "That man right there killed him. That's how he repaid the man who saved his life. I won't say that what I tried to do was the right thing, but I'm sorry I wasn't able to go through with it. If I had, maybe Jupin would still be alive today." Letting his hand fall to his side, he awkwardly made his way back to his seat. The people murmured to themselves as the next person stood up and made her way to the front. It was Abigail. "State your name, citizen of Rockford." "Abigail Mossflower." Here she looked Edmund in the eyes with an icy glare. "I was soon to take the surname Hatcher." Murmurs spread through the room again. "And what do you have to say concerning the matter, Abigail Mossflower?" "I watched Jupe tend to this man's wounds. I myself helped. Jupe was kind to him. He gave him food to eat and a bed to sleep in and honest work to fill his time." Tears began to fall from her eyes as her voice wavered. "Jupe never deserved the harm that came to him. He was a good man, but this filthy lowlife murdered him. He pretended to be his friend and then killed him." Here she stopped, unable to continue. Bringing her hand up to her face, she covered her mouth as she let out a strained sob. She clenched her eyes shut. One of the older men behind her stood and gently put his hands on her quivering shoulders. Abigail calmed her breathing slightly and looked Edmund in the eyes. "I wish you had died that night." She turned and accepted the man's help back to her seat. Merritt, visibly annoyed, waved his hand at the townfolk. "While all this may be true, it is not enough to convict this man of murdering Jupin Hatcher. Didn't anyone here bear witness to him at the scene of this heinous act?" He turned, scanning the crowd impatiently. A man in the back cleared his throat. "Theod!" There was a scuffling noise as the man hesitantly stood up from his seat, nervously looking around. All eyes shifted in his direction. "Theod was there. He was the one who found him. He can prove it. Where is he?" Edmund glanced at Merritt and saw a smug grin quickly vanish behind a mask of concern. He had baited them. Despair ran through Edmund's mind. The weirder knew that none could prove Edmund's guilt, so he had steered them in a different direction. Edmund had killed Theod. Merritt had seen him do it. No one would question him. Why would a truth-seer lie? He was as good as finished. "Yes, where is he indeed?" Merritt said in a quiet, worried voice, barely audible to the gathered people. "Where is Theod, and why is he not here giving his testimony?" Edmund could feel people in the crowd leaning in, straining to hear the weirder. "I'll tell you why. Theod is not here because this man killed him." Astonished gasps rushed through the gathered townsfolk. Merritt continued. "He killed him in cold blood, with no reason compelling him. He killed him simply because he could." Edmund scanned the faces in the crowd. His gaze was met with wide eyes and shocked expressions of rage and disbelief. "When I went to fetch him from his cell, I saw him savagely scraping a knife across the inside of Theod's ribs." There was silence in the courtroom. Abigail stood up and called to Merritt. "Where is your proof that he is dead, weirder?" Slightly taken aback by the question, yet visibly cool, Merritt smiled. "If you don't believe me, a truth-seer, by all means, go see for yourself." A few men near the door exchanged looks with each other before quickly getting to their feet and leaving the room, doors slamming shut behind them. Once again there was silence in the courtroom. Edmund felt all eyes upon him. He shifted his weight uncomfortably as he stood in the center of the crowded room. He wanted to run, to forget all that had happened. Moments later, the men burst through the doors into the courtroom, out of breath and white in the face. "It's true!" the man in front gasped. "The weirder spoke the truth. Theod is dead. He was stabbed in the back, and there were bruises on his neck." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. George shouted, "Is that true? Did you kill Theod?" Others echoed his question. Merritt lifted his hand, silencing the room. Turning to Edmund, he spoke softly. "Answer the question." A spark of pain jumped through the collar around Edmund's neck, causing him to tense. "Speak." Pulling in a shaky breath, he spoke. It is true." "What?" barked Merritt. "What is true?" Another spark from the collar. "I killed him," winced Edmund. I killed Theod. But only because—" Pain from the collar cut off his speech. His hands clenched into fists against the punishing magic from the collar. Grinding his teeth together, Edmund braced himself as the pain continued. "And there you have it," said Merritt to the townsfolk. "A confession. You are all standing witness to what has taken place here today. I hereby take this man, Edmund, into the custody of the Weirding Guild. He will be brought before the High Court and tried. When he is found guilty, and he will be found so, he shall be punished with the utmost justice and fairness of Baal Mardu." People in the crowd nodded in agreement as Merritt spoke. Some fidgeted uneasily at the mention of Baal Mardu, the Hammer of Order. Merritt turned to Edmund. "Kneel." Pain shot from the collar to Edmund's legs, forcing him to bend his knees and fall to the floor. Placing a hand upon Edmund's forehead, Merritt spoke in a vibrating voice, heavy with magic. "This I speak to you with the full power of the Weirding Guild and the omniscient Baal Mardu. May you never find rest. May you never feel comfort. May you never be at peace until the day that you set foot within the High Court of the Weirding Guild. Ever shall you be driven toward the Citadel of Order. If I fail to bring you there myself, then you will be compelled to journey there upon your own accord. From this point forward, you will never be free. You belong to the Guild. You belong to Baal Mardu." Then, in a deep, resonating voice, the young weirder spoke 2 words that struck to the core of Edmund's being. "Dominus Weirda." The hexagon on his forehead glowed white. As Edmund knelt with the pain from the collar racking his body and preventing him from moving, silver shackles burst from the air around him, and shining as bright as the sun, they encircled his body, wrapping round and round again, until finally they pulled themselves tight. Edmund felt as though he was being torn apart by the ethereal chains as they yanked tighter and tighter across his body, sinking into his flesh. Bursts of memory spattered through his mind, binding magic. Edmund threw his head back and screamed, long and hard. Merritt, with a hand still gripping Edmund's forehead, gritted his teeth as the powerful magic flowed through him, emanating from his hexagon. The townsfolk began to back into the corners of the courtroom, nervously. All they saw was Edmund on his knees, screaming in agony, as the weirder's symbol glowed ever brighter, illuminating the deepest shadows of the room. Tears rolled freely down Edmund's face. Sinking beneath his skin, the chains pulled tighter still. Pushing past the overwhelming pain from the collar, Edmund grabbed desperately at his magic. A flash of glittering light arced like lightning from Edmund's head to somewhere in the crowd, before slipping from his grasp. The pain was simply too much to endure. Edmund ceased his resistance, and the chains sank straight to his heart. Merritt removed his hand, and the pain dissipated. Letting out a long, defeated breath, Edmund knelt there, a shallow husk of himself, staring at the ceiling with an open mouth and sunken eyes. Merritt, breathing heavily, spoke to the crowd. Thus has he been bound. You all shall now forget his face and go back to your lives. The Weirding Guild He swayed slightly, exhausted from channeling such powerful magic. Grabbing Edmund by the shoulder, he dragged him to his feet and quickly led him outside. Edmund could not resist, and he began to feel the strong urge to run eastward to the Weirding Guild. Merritt led him to the stables down the street. Wasting no time, the weirder found his horse. Edmund slumped to his knees, still reeling from the pain. Merritt struggled to get the saddle over the horse's back, and after trying for a few moments, he staggered backward and fell against the pillar at the stall's entrance. He was breathing heavily, and sweat beaded on his face. You, he rasped. Saddle those damn horses. He slid to the ground and began to rifle through his saddlebag. Edmund stumbled to his feet to obey. In the courtroom, the townsfolk were beginning to shuffle out, stunned at what they had just witnessed. The magic they had seen, the murders confessed to. At least the truth-seer had taken care of the murderer. At least they were safe now. Rockford could now go back to the way it had been before. One by one, they left the building, unsure of what they had seen, but all too happy to obey the weirder's last order. Forget. All the people left the room but one. One remained staring into the circle of light that beamed down from the window in the courtroom's high ceiling. Sitting in the middle of the gathered chairs and benches, Abigail sat in stunned silence. Tears trickled slowly from her eyes. As she stood there in the midst of the fearful people, watching the young truth-seer place a spell upon the man she had thought she hated, the man she thought had killed her love, a brilliant streak of light shot from his head and struck her. The force of the blow had knocked her to her seat. There she had sat in silence as the rest of the events played out. As soon as the bolt of magic had touched her, she remembered. But the memories that played through her mind's eye were not hers. They were Edmund's. She saw all that had happened since he arrived in Rockford. She relived all the time that he had spent with Jupe. She rode next to him on the cart as they talked of magic and of Rockford. She sat in Edmund's place as he polished tools at the table with Jupe. She wielded a scythe next to Jupe in his field as they worked, talked, and laughed together. She sat drowsily next to Willow as they talked late into the night about trade in the Eastlands. She desperately pulled Willow from the grip of the wild spirit after they had stopped the band of thugs from destroying Jupe's entire crop. She dashed terrified through the forest as the scent of smoke filled her nostrils. She coughed as she broke down the door to Jupe's room while his house burned, only to find him already dead, slashed across the throat. She woke up in a cell with a collar around her neck. She stabbed Theod in the back for murdering Jupe. She sat in horror as the young weirder appeared behind the iron bars. Abigail put a hand to her mouth as she gasped at the revelation. Bloody hammer, what have we done? Edmund and Merritt rode their horses northward along King's Road, toward the Northland's capital. Beyond lay the stronghold of the Weirding Guild, the citadel of order. The destination filled his heart with dread. However, with every step they took toward the citadel, he could feel the binding magic loosen its grip upon his heart. Edmund was beginning to recuperate from the intense pain that had almost left him dead that morning. He watched Merritt out of the corner of his eye. They had been riding side by side for the past hour. He looked young. Too young. Strapped to the back of his saddle, there was a short sword wrapped tightly in his blanket, as if to keep it from escaping. If the weirder needed to use it, he would have to sit down and meticulously undo all the buckles. This was obviously his first journey on his own. He was probably either nervous or overconfident. Edmund subtly stole a glance at Merritt's face. His mouth was twisted into a smirk as he swayed, back straight in the saddle. Not nervous, then. That was good. Overconfidence was a weakness he could exploit. At last, Edmund broke the silence. Tell me something, weirder. Merritt glanced over at him. Why am I being taken? You mean besides the murder of the village thug? You were hunting me before that, weren't you? Why did you blame me for the murder of Jupe? Was it just to cover up the fact that you were the one who killed him? But why did you kill him in the first place? The boy, seeing the serious expression on Edmund's face, looked incredulous. Really? You don't understand why the Weirding Guild is hunting you like a criminal? He stared at Edmund for a moment before realization washed across his face. Your memory. Of course. Oh, my poor unstable prisoner. If you only knew the crimes you committed against the guild. You're right, Estlin Weir. It goes much deeper than a simple need for a scapegoat. Merritt turned away from Edmund and rode on in silence. After a moment, when it was clear he did not intend to continue, Edmund blurted out, Aren't you going to tell me? Merritt smiled, still facing forward. No. He chuckled to himself quietly. Edmund, getting angry, snorted in frustration. I'll remember eventually. What good will it do you not telling me now? If you remembered who you were, said Merritt, his tone darkened, nearing a growl, and what you've done to the Weirding Guild, Estlin Weir, you would be trying much, much harder to escape than you are now. And no, you won't remember, not while you have that collar around your neck. The cause of your memory loss was a spell wrought by the treacherous Amor of Chaos, Tiamar, the Raven Queen. Here the boy leaned over and spat onto the ground. It is her magic that is binding your memory. Do not know why she would have cast such a spell on you, of all beings, but the guild is glad she did. Your own magic is powerful enough to fight back against the binding. I'm sure even now it strains against the spell form restraining it. However," he turned and looked Edmund in the eye, gesturing with a finger to his own neck. "As long as that collar is around your neck, you cannot touch your magic, and your memory will remain lost to you." He smirked and looked away. "I'll tell you this, though, Estlin Weir. Every young weirder knows the stories of the rogue, murderous mage called Edmund Stormhand." They rode on, plodding along down the muddy road in silence. The tree line followed southward on their right side as they headed east. The trees, unlike those of the Witchwood, were thin and young. They were spread out enough that, if a traveler looked hard, they could see quite far into the forest. To their left lay an open, hilly grassland that stretched for miles to the north and east. At the edge of that, Edmund could just make out another forest, sloping gently upward on the hills. Behind them, to the west, as Rockford and the Witchwood grew ever more distant with each passing moment, a determined pair of feet glided stealthily after them through the sparse tree line. Well, that wraps up part 1. Make sure you tune in for part 2 later this week. And in the meantime, leave a comment and a like. If you can't wait for part 2, then you can head on over to Amazon and purchase the full-length book there. Or you can click on the link down below. I'll see you all next time, but until then, enjoy the adventure.